You are listening to the We Need to Talk About Oscar podcast, and this is our spoiler-filled conversation with Parker Laramie, the editor of Sing Sing.
If I work on a movie and I barely make any money and barely anyone sees it, I feel fine. And it wins no awards, like I sleep soundly at night. So that's the important part.
We have this little tradition on the show that we start by asking our guests to turn back the wheel of time and tell us about how they fell in love with films. So Parker, what's your story?
So I grew up here in Los Angeles, and my parents worked in the industry, not so much in film, I guess. They worked in television a little bit, but they mostly worked in advertising. But my dad was like a big film buff. And I'd go to movies with him pretty much every weekend. And if we weren't going to the theater, we were watching stuff at home. And from a very early age, I was just kind of immersed in it. So I don't know, looking back, turning back the wheel of time, as you said, I feel like it was sort of inevitable. I don't know if it's hard for me to imagine having gone down any other road just because it was kind of all I knew, which isn't to say that I don't love it. I really do. But yeah, it's hard to imagine having, ended up being like a chef or something.
And on to nowadays, our project at hand, Sing Sing. Your previous collaboration with Greg Kwedar and Clint Bentley on Jockey was in a kind of inverted position, with Clint directing and co-writing with Greg. How did the dynamics of the three of you working together change on this project due to this change in roles?
Well, I got introduced to Clint through Greg. I had done a documentary that Greg had produced, and so I kind of met him through that. And when he and Clint started working on Jockey, he called me, partially because they were going to do a lot of improv and sort of shoot it in a documentary style. The DP has shot a couple of documentaries as well. And so they wanted somebody that wasn't afraid to go off script. And, I'm used to there being no script. So I was like, yeah, that's fine. That won't be a problem at all. So at the beginning of Jockey, the other thing about Jockey was Clint and Greg had been writing together for years. But in terms of a feature film, Greg had directed a film already. He'd done a film called Trans-Pecos that Clint had produced. And so they were flipping. And so at the beginning, it did kind of feel like, between Greg being sort of the intermediary, the guy who introduced us, it was very much Greg and Clint and I. They're based in Texas, I'm based in LA, so they flew in for a week for us all to work together, and it was very much the three of us. Clint was very much, at the helm, but Greg had been his producer and his co-writer, and so it was the three of us very much together. But then by the end of the edit on Jockey, Greg had very much stepped away, and it was just me and Clint. And by the time Sing Sing rolled around, it was Clint was involved, but I think Greg had very much already sort of decided oh, okay, this is my vision. And Clint was okay, I'm going to take a step back and sort of be a fresh pair of eyes for you guys. So whenever you need to send a cut or whatever, I can be that, I can sort of see the forest for the trees a little bit more for you guys, which was super nice. And even though they work really well together, they have very different styles, at least in the edit. And I think on set as well, from what I can tell, both from seeing the footage and just talking with them, Greg is much more sort of immediate and instinctual. And Clint kind of likes to experiment, and he approaches it a bit more cerebrally. So it's funny, in a lot of ways, working with them is very similar. And my connection with both of them feels very strong, and yet they are I don't know, they're almost yin and yang. And I guess that's why they work together so well, is they really balance out each other really well.
You just alluded to this a little bit, that you have some experience in documentary filmmaking, and by some, I mean loads. In my eyes, Sing Sing has this documentary style approach to it. Plus, of course, it's inspired by and based on the life of Divine G, who's portrayed by Coleman Domingo in this film. Does this attribute of a film help you, or rather it complicates the process as you still have to remind yourself that this is in fact a narrative feature film and you have to edit it with that in your mind?
I definitely think it helps. I never thought of it as being sort of a hindrance. And I don't know, a question that I often get asked, because people can see that I'm sort of straddling both unscripted documentary and narrative scripted stuff, is sort of like, which one do you like best? And my answer is always kind of like, well, I kind of like documentaries that feel like scripted films, and I like scripted films that feel like documentaries. So working on a movie like Sing Sing is perfect because it is literally both, right? There are these sequences in the film that are purely documentary, where they just rolled the camera and essentially, for example, the audition scene, that was completely unscripted. The only thing that it said in the script was, the guys all audition for various parts in the play. And of course, they had done it in real life already, and they knew the characters, and so they had a starting place, a launching off point. But a bit of this made it into the film. They sort of posed questions of the guys, like, why do you like to do this, and what's your favorite role that you've ever played, and these kind of questions that you would hear in the context of a documentary that would be these launching off points for these character building sections of a doc. And in the context of the film, they're sort of within this self-contained portion of the movie, which is what I like about working with Greg and Clint. I mean, Clint had something very similar in Jockey, where there's a scene where there's a bunch of these jockeys that worked on the track where they were filming. They got 7, 8, 9, 10 of them together and just asked them questions about the injuries that they've sustained and, what the life of a jockey is like and all this kind of stuff. And Clint and Greg are really good at because they've done documentaries as well, taking that documentary world and containing it into something structured. They structure it into their film in a really smart way, I think, where you get to kind of just live in that documentary world for those specific scenes, but you're always anchored by the very structured, scripted world of the rest of the film. And in the case of Sing Sing, it's, the relationship between Divine I and Divine G. And that, for me, the issue that I have with working on documentaries is structure. It's all structure, essentially, what I do. Editing individual scenes is more or less in service of the structure in general, rather than in scripted. It is a bit more you have to find the scene. You have to find the scene between the two people having a dialogue conversation, whatever it is. Whereas in documentaries, it's much more sort of okay, how is this going to feed us into the next scene? And so I guess to bring it all back to Sing Sing, it's nice to be able to work in that realm of documentary, to see the guys for who they actually are, without the burden of sort of sculpting a narrative around their stories. I mean, as great as sort of traditional storytelling is, it can be sort of, you end up having to kill a lot of babies, I would say, in documentary. A lot of the greatest moments just don't serve the overall story. And I think the thing that I liked about Sing Sing was it didn't really matter. There's this great story that the character Carmine tells about, which is a true story from his past, of going to a park with his wife when they were younger and drinking these Manhattan specials, this soda that you could get. It's just that may or may not have worked in a documentary. You would have gotten into all these questions how do we see it? Do we recreate it? And it becomes corny. But in the context of Sing Sing, it's perfect because it's this contained scene of these exercises that these guys do. And you just get to sit there and listen to them tell the story. And it's simple and it's beautiful.
And then there is the question of runtime. What I'm always super fascinated by, whether to what level is it intentional. And if there is a sweet spot for the length a movie should be, not that this year's Venice lineup was just announced, and I was super happy to see that, for example, The Brutalist is 3.5 hours, but at the same time, this film feels like it might be right there in the sweet spot with about an hour and 45 minutes, or at least for the type of film it is. Was this the aim?
The question of runtime is an interesting one because, so vis-a-vis Sing Sing, I mean, just to sort of give you an impression, the first cut was about 2.5 hours long, which is typical. I feel like, and maybe this is just me, maybe this is just my style. Like the first assembly always seems to be 2.5 hours long. The movie I'm working on right now, the first assembly was 2.5 hours. So maybe that's just me. Obviously that was not going to work. But what Greg said when he watched it was like, I kind of just sat down and enjoyed it, which is a huge compliment, obviously, but also is a testament to like, okay, so we have a movie that is like engaging, or we had a cut that was up on its feet enough, let's put it that way, that Greg was able to sort of, he'd spent at that point like 6 years developing this movie, and he was at a point where he could just kind of enjoy what he had shot at the very least. I mean, this is the first assembly, right? But we knew that we had to get it down to at least under 2 hours. And I think, Greg and I never had specific conversations about runtime. I like to aim for 90 minutes because there's something really great about seeing a movie that is super tight and satisfying. That having been said, like there's plenty of super long movies that I love. And, we all will sit down and watch, hours on end of a series or whatever it is. So the timing of it is kind of a mathematical equation that you have to hit. It's like if it's under 2 hours, you can make more money in the theaters. You can probably get more eyeballs on streaming because people will look at it and go like, oh yeah, sure, I'll invest in that for 2 hours. But what it really comes down to with runtime is like, how long does it feel? And that's something that you just kind of feel your way through. You cut it and you watch it back. You do it again, you watch it back, and it's kind of like, then you look at your watch and go, oh, okay, cool, we're under 2 hours, or we're at like 2:15. Like this is a problem. We're gonna have to start killing some darlings. So I don't know. That tends to be the approach, and that was definitely the approach on Sing Sing. I don't think we ever had explicit conversations about how long it needed to be or anything like that. It was always a feel thing.
Cool. And in this amount of time, you introduce a great number of characters, most of them supporting, but all pivotal to the story. How was the juggling of different screen times and backing everyone around the characters played by Coleman and, to a point, Clarence?
It's interesting. We didn't, the script for Sing Sing was like remarkably well written, and particularly the opening. Like I would say, usually both in the documentaries that I've done and in the other movies that I've done with Clint and Greg, the opening is the hardest part. And with this one, it wasn't. Like the beginning, the first 10 minutes, we did them, and we were like, okay, cool, that's good. Do you want to use take 2 instead of take 1? Yeah, sure. Like very simple. It wasn't until we got into the second act that things started to get hairy, which I would say is like after Divine Eye joins, after they've decided to do the play. That's kind of where things started where the juggling was hard, and it wasn't so much about keeping the characters alive. Like I think there are a lot of characters, but again, the script was well written and they shot it well, particularly Pat. Like Pat is very good about getting coverage, and so you're able to keep characters alive really easily. Pat Scola, the EP. So it was never a challenge to be like, okay, we got to introduce all these guys. I mean, I think probably the reason it works so well is the audition sequence that I was talking about earlier, where we get to meet each of them. I guess at the end, there was only one guy that didn't make it into the audition seat. We found a place for at least a, cameo from everybody who they shot on that day. But you got to sort of know all the guys that way. And it's like, you're not going to forget, Dino after he's rolled around pretending that he's, battling a gladiator, or watching Dap, waltz with the air. You're not going to forget characters like that. And then it's just a case of keeping them alive. Yeah, I would say the script took care of that. And their process of letting the guys improvise and stuff, it made all that very easy.
Actually, another thing I would really like to pick your brain about is something the cinematographer Pat told me about, which is the fact that you had Coleman for a truly short period, yet he's almost in every shot of the movie. How did this, or even did this materialize in the footage you were faced with in the editing room?
Well, and it's funny because, at least in my memory, they started shooting without Coleman. So I think they had like the first, and I don't remember how many days it was. In my memory, it's like the first 5 days or the first week of shooting was they did everything that wasn't with Coleman. So they did all the stuff with Clarence. There's a section of the movie towards the end where Coleman kind of disappears.
Yeah.
Which was another problem in the edit, but it was kind of like, well, this was we had to lose the actor for a couple of days, and so we had to figure it out.
It works.
Yeah, no, I totally. I mean, it actually worked better than I think we all expected it to, but it still was a little tricky. There were side effects to it. It was kind of like none of us minded leaving Coleman for that period of time, but it is a tricky thing when your main character just disappears in the third act of your movie. Like it's a big swing. And I would say that Nate, or the guy that plays Charlie at the end, comes in and talks about baking donuts and being with his dog at the end. He really saves the movie. I mean, he kind of makes the movie, in my opinion. That was also something that they shot in the first week. I guess I'll talk about it from my perspective. The first batch of footage I got was just with the guys. And I guess Paul Racy came in to do one day. But other than that, it was like very much like, all right, we set out to make a movie about this like quasi documentary about these guys who were formerly incarcerated and were in this theater program. It was like, that was very much the first week of shooting, was just them, it was all that stuff of them like rehearsing around the prison and yeah, dealing with the fallout of after, Coleman's character, Divine G, has his blow up at the end. All of that stuff was the first stuff. And the effect that it had was like warming us up to the world. And from my perspective, it was like Coleman then slipped into that. Like they had already hit their rhythm by the end of the week. And so Coleman kind of slipped in. Paul Racy slipped in. These more seasoned, more experienced guys slipped in at the end. I'll correct myself. Sean San Jose was also there the first week, and he has, to my knowledge, was not formerly incarcerated and is like best friends with Coleman. Like he's been acting with Coleman for decades. So he, I guess, was also sort of setting the tone and getting warmed up in the same way that the rest of the guys were. But my read was that the guys really led the charge. Like the guys, they set the tone. Everybody got into the groove of the movie with the guys. And then Coleman and Paul kind of dropped in and assimilated into whatever they had already been building, which I think definitely served the film very, very well.
Freedom, understandably, or the lack of freedom and the need of freedom, understandably lingers through the whole film. But your job has to be systematic, for the pacing to be on point, for the story to be coherent, and for the story to be able to deliver and hit the right notes. But for you as an editor, what does freedom mean? Where does it come in during the process?
I mean, and maybe this is sort of an obvious answer, but when you're cutting, like freedom comes from, to take it back, like I worked for this editor for a while who always used to say, like, you can't cut from a place of fear, which means like thinking, oh, the director's not going to like this, or we're going to lose the audience, all of those kinds of things. And those things always are still in the back of my mind for sure. But you can tell, and producers will often give notes, particularly now with the state of the industry, like people want to make sure they're making money, And so they're giving notes and they're cutting from a place of fear. And it's just a lot harder to cut that way. And I've been on those movies, I've been on those shows, and it's a bummer. And freedom comes from, like I was talking about with the runtime earlier. It's like, just sit down and watch the movie and listen to what your body is telling you about the movie. Don't listen to your head. And I guess the first thing I was going to say, the obvious answer with freedom comes from like being able to work with people like Clint and Greg, and also having like an established relationship with them where they trust me. And they're also, I would say that they're writers before they're directors or filmmakers, and editing is very much a form of writing. So there's an understanding of the process, and, they don't panic. when the first cut comes in and it's a mess. And we'll talk about scenes more conceptually. Yeah, there are notes that come in that are like, take 3 frames off of this shot or this. Can we swap out this performance with a different one? And, very specific. And we'll sit down and we'll like work on scenes together. Like that's the only way that the scenes actually come together is when they sit down with me for sure, where their intention is mixed and combined with my kind of fresh eyes on the thing. But freedom definitely comes from like watching the cut with them, having a big picture conversation, and then like sitting alone with it and working with it and just kind of making my way through the film and going, oh, remember this one thing we were talking about? I could bring that in here, like the way that they want the movie to feel. This is the scene where we can apply it, and that's the kind of stuff that like it only happens when you're working alone, at least for me. I don't know. Maybe it happens sometimes when I'm working with them, but it's easier to sort of track your own thoughts, I think, when you're on your own. And so I don't know. As an editor, that is not always something that you get to have. Not necessarily always something you want to have. Actually, sometimes you want more of a director, but there's definitely times when it's nice to be able to just work with the cut yourself and work that way.
Last but not least, I don't want to jinx anything, but what I believe we can say is that the buzz is there, and also not that there is any shame in breaking out with a blockbuster or something around that ballpark, but it must be or must feel quite special to experience all this that's been going on and swirling around Sing Sing for some time and hopefully for some more time. How do you handle expectations towards yourself, from yourself, and towards the trajectory of a project you're involved in?
That's a great question. You ask good questions.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know. I had a director once tell me that I'm sort of a Buddhist when it comes to expectations, where it's like I have a very Zen way of looking at it, which is like I have 0 expectations. In all honesty, like I hope that every movie I work on is seen by as many people as possible and that the people that see it walk away feeling great. And for me personally, when I get into a project, my expectations are that I'm going to walk away at the end of each day feeling good about what I did, or at least by the end of the project, I'm going to feel good about it. I'm going to feel proud of the work that I've done and that I'm going to love working with the people that I worked with. Everything else is like gravy, like I think more than anything, like the important part for me on this film is the awareness that it raises. I think it's a quote unquote important film in that way. And I think that that's sort of the North Star for it. If it achieves on that level, then it's a success. In terms of buzz and awards, whatever, I mean, it feels like there's definitely a lot of buzz going on, like you said. And I think that that's great. More than anything, I hope Clarence gets his due. I think he's really, really talented, and I don't think that the world has any idea. And I think they should. I think all the guys are incredibly talented and deserve recognition for that. I think Greg and Clint wrote a great screenplay, and I think that they deserve to be recognized for that. I guess the implication of your question is like whether the editing is, like I said, I have 0 expectations. It's really hard for me to believe that there would be a ton of recognition for it, I think, but I don't know. I really don't. I have no concept sort of what people are really looking for in editing when they give awards, because editing is so much more like, it's so collaborative. It's like, even from the outside, it's like, you can't really tell, like I think I can see it, I guess, which probably means other editors can see it.
Yeah. And that also makes it kind of special that the ones who will be able to decide it are your peers.
Yeah, and that would be lovely. And insofar as it opens up doors and allows me to work on more exciting and bigger projects, great. Like I said, my expectations are 0. If I'm not working on something that I'm proud of, then, my whole life is falling apart. My whole identity is wrapped up in this thing, for sure. But like, I've been doing it just long enough now to realize that like the important thing is that I feel good at the end of the day and that I enjoy the people that I'm working with. When those things aren't in place, if I come up at the end of the day, I'm like, what the hell am I working on? Or like, why are they asking me to do it this way? Like, that just feels cheap, or that feels corny, or, whatever. Then I'm like miserable. Or if the people that I'm working with I just don't jive with them, the vibes aren't right, that's when I feel awful. If I work on a movie and I barely make any money and barely anyone sees it, I feel fine. And it wins no awards, like I sleep soundly at night. So that's the important part.
Parker, thank you so much for taking the time and for expressing how much of a teamwork this whole process is, especially here in Sing Sing. And I can't wait to see what you do next.
Yeah. And I got to say, you've got a good podcast here. You ask really good questions of like the crafts, the people that you've spoken to on your show, and the questions that you ask. Like, we don't tend to get the privilege to talk about what we do in this way. At least I haven't. You hear a lot of actors and directors and writers that get to do it, but to talk about it in depth and to get questions that are, resonant and deep and, sophisticated is a pleasure and a privilege. So thank you.